Hey everybody, welcome back to the main stage. This is the second to last main stage talk of the day. You know what they say, first is the worst, second is the best. So, guys, this is going to be a really, really good talk, not just because Cathy Hennessey, president of ATAP, the group responsible for putting on this whole event today, no big deal, Cathy, is moderating this panel and is on this panel. But I think one of the interesting things, and Cathy pushed really hard to get this on the main stage specifically so everybody could see it, was the importance of AI and how we kind of are evaluating it. Because, I just gave a talk about AI and that the word is ubiquitous and obscured. And so understanding, like, when you're like, I need an AI tool, like, which is my AI voice, by the way, what does that mean? How do you evaluate that? What goes into it? And I think, Cathy, to give you props, this is a really, really important topic for folks to hear about right now. And so I'm not going to waste any more of their time. I want you guys to really soak up this data. You're not going to get another chance like this at least for a year. So have at it, y'all.
All right. Thank you, Batman. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for this Fireside Chat. It's really designed for our TA professionals in a framework to think about how are we going to evaluate all the AI tools. I don't know if you're like me, but I am getting inundated with, those quick emails that say they're going to solve all my problems through AI. And, I don't know where to go, how to ask for, is this really AI, or what does that even mean? So today, and then, how do we deal with that from a compliance and legal standpoint? We've had even our own experience of, do we have to worry about disparate impact and different things that might happen with that? And certainly that is our fear of our compliance team, our legal, our HR team. So I'm delighted to be joined by Athena, who is our ethical AI leader and advocate, and the founder and CEO of HiredScore. Athena's company, HiredScore, uses its AI so seamlessly and connects and integrates with clients' HR systems to bring more fair and efficient hiring and workforce decisions. Athena, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, thank you, Cathy, so much for having me on and for this group, especially on TA Day, of talking about one of our favorite topics, which is really how do you think about AI from an ethical framework, from a compliance framework, and I started HiredScore 10 years ago. So a decade doing this. We were one of the first technologies in the space to bring artificial intelligence to talent acquisition and talent management. And my background before that, Cathy, was focused on AI in regulated areas. So focused on use of AI in a hospital, for doctors, for healthcare, where that foundation of transparency, explainability, and testability for bias was absolutely fundamental, especially when we're talking about patients and outcomes. And always thought, how do we bring that same type of technology into hiring decisions, promotional decisions for the largest companies in the world? So been on the warpath ever since of how do we help companies, especially Fortune 500, which is our focus, embrace that move from that pre-AI to post-AI. I think we spent the last 10 years focused on the digital divide, and now it's about augmentation and autonomous support for recruiting and talent management. So excited to be here today to talk more about this topic, and especially with the TA leaders on the line in how to think about what should you expect of vendors? What should you be provided? What is that best in class? And I know we'll touch a bit also on the regulations, which are moving at a very fast pace. So much to cover, and grateful to be here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we really want to think about today, get folks thinking about how to evaluate vendors, right? And who's selling these artificial intelligence tools for talent acquisition, and really provide, as I said, for that TA leader, that individual contributor who might be looking at tools for their system, tech teams, and what is it that we're going to ultimately ask these vendors? And what are some of the recent HR laws and standards that we have to look out for? So Athena, thinking, why you say it's 10 years, it's still relatively new for TA, for talent acquisition, really. And so how can leaders think about how to help their internal teams, particularly those, the security, IT, legal, compliance, navigate that process of evaluating vendors? And how can we help them get comfortable, as you said, with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. When we speak about compliant AI, right, as you mentioned, there's this spectrum: security, data privacy. Most orgs have pretty good processes, auditing and checking for SOC 2 type 2 compliance. I would say AI for TA does have special nuances, particularly something we're seeing more and more with, beginning with GDPR, then CCPA, and now EU regulations on artificial intelligence, just furthering that, which is this notion of, is this data consented for use? Can we use that to evaluate an individual? Has that individual, properly signified in a form, a field, a collection, that it's okay to use that source of information when evaluating them for a job they've applied to? Or if they didn't get the first job they applied to, or they signed up for the talent community, and a lot of these systems, CRMs, ATSs, even HCMs of your employees, hold consented and unconsented for purpose data. So how do you, one, make sure we're not just asking security and privacy kind of 101, the SOC 2 and the InfoSec and those other guidelines, but actually we're getting asked more and more for validated proof that our system is differentiating, even if we integrate into a platform that has both consented and unconsented data, that we are only using, and we provide proof and evidence of that use of just that consented information from that individual, which is fascinating. I think the next thing that's quite interesting is when we think about security and privacy is data purging, right? So a lot of the clients we work with are global, and the purge requirements in Europe versus the US versus other geographies might actually contradict themselves. Or we have nuances like a German employee applies into a US rec, they need to be purged as per Works Council on a 6-month cadence, but it's a US rec and we need to hold that data for 2 years for OFCCP. And how can you, and so we actually had to build a special mechanism that would say, not just by rec location, but by individual primary address, or by individual citizenship, or by recruiter location, any number of these varieties will dictate potential purge schedules of that individual. And that becomes a really important thing if an AI is holding data and kind of violating that, how you need to treat that on all these different kind of levels gets really interesting. Then I think that last piece is what I know we're going to dive even deeper into, but the ethical and the fairness, right? And so when we think about, and I'll say this with a caveat, the next 6 to 12 months, we'll probably have an entirely new agenda to talk about, because these laws are moving so fast, right? Even since April, we now have EU legislation around artificial intelligence. In the last 12 months, we have Illinois state by state laws, like the Illinois Artificial Intelligence Video Interview Act. And we have the city of New York proposing bias audits for artificial intelligence related to talent acquisition. So the spectrum of how fast this is moving in terms of requiring and mandating, I think the key is, Cathy, to take away that we'll dive deeper into, is this notion of transparency, this notion of auditability, this notion of client-specific brain and artificial intelligence, because you could have a general AI and maybe that passes all the tests, but then that applied to my, oil and natural gas company just blew the roof on that audit that looked like it passed, but now applied to my data totally does not pass. So specific to company audits, no different than what OFCCP and EEOC requires, and all kinds of auditing and logging requirements, as well as a lot of restrictions on what's an autonomous decision versus where do we need the humans to take a decision, particularly if there's an ambiguity, a judgment, or a potential bias.
Absolutely. I know. So you mentioned ethical AI. So let's talk about that. What does that really mean? And what documentation or test results should TA leaders ask and receive for that showcase best in class?
Yeah, I love that question, because I think a lot of our TA leaders have been told, maybe by vendors, that's proprietary or that would disclose our IP or secrets. We've never once said that. There should be nothing that, a TA leader asks for that a vendor can't provide or produce because it discloses IP. So I think this is a really important topic, especially for our TA leaders. On average, we're asked across all our clients for a bias audit of our algorithms applied to them, to their jobs and to their data, and we produce that. We're asked for the raw data and the output of our recommendations to make sure they're fair and equitable for similarly qualified candidates. We're asked for evidence that the learning and the continued improvements in the system don't then take an unbiased system and make it biased. So how do you have a control and a validated, audited log of any improvements, features, modifications you're making on a product or an AI standpoint, or continuing to keep those same principles of bias mitigation? And then kind of the last piece is an overarching auditable logging of inputs, of outputs, and a clear delineation between any race or gender data at all points in time in artificial intelligence decision making, that is never commingled, that's never mixed, that's never fed into that. We actually have evidence of that on our back end, which is yet another requirement. So I think on all of those levels, our clients have kind of that spectrum of the same responsibility a human would have to justify decisions, to show that decisions are fair, to show that decisions not at another company, but at this company were made in that thorough way, and that data was never used in that decision-making matrix in any way.
Sure, because you're right. You think about documentation just of what legal requires from a note-taking standpoint, right? So are you saying that a vendor, which kind of leads into the next question, when we find one that we think is reliable or passes kind of that pressure test, are we asking them, or what's that responsibility of them to provide that log of audits or that transparency behind the scenes?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think that log, that audit, that report specific to company, that should be readily available for every client at any point in time from that AI vendor if they're kind of following those additional protocols. I would say I think the other thing is the ability to talk through with the client, just for any AI vendor operating in our space, that subject matter expertise of what are the various local, because we do see city by city based, state, national, especially in the US, and then on a global standard, it's not just laws like the EU, but it's also kind of global best practices. I'm on the World Economic Forum committee. The UN has a committee. We have a number of international governing bodies that, although they're not laws that were mandated by, they are the principles that these solutions should follow. And I think just an inventory, which we do provide for our clients, of what are all of those saying across TA tools and tech. It might not apply to us, for example, because it's a video interview AI law, but there's usually a lot of foundational things in those laws that relate to personal data privacy, that relate to data use, that relate to transparency and explainability, that I think a vendor in our space needs to know, because odds are that is going to come into the rest of the spaces, even if it started over there in video interviews. So even that documentation of what are the latest regs and what do they mean for any AI, and what components of those are likely to be translated, right? Because TA needs to be forward thinking, not buy a tool, implement it, and then a law comes, right? And now that vendor hasn't caught up. We like to say, we're 3 to 5 years ahead of any laws that are actually written and passed in terms of that compliance, which is a really important thing for the TA team to be able to navigate internally: employment law, compliance, and global legal, or even that ethics department, that they know what the future will probably hold, and that vendor is already either preparing to be ready for that or already has that readiness.
Absolutely. So think about, my IT department has a very strict list of things that I must provide them if I were to consider a new technology. What do you think the AI vendor's responsibility is with that versus the TA leader to really help our internal teams, navigate that from the compliance and legal side? What's their responsibility?
Yeah. So first, we've drawn up the list of what's that best in class, best practice, most stringent client demand, and then have all that ready so that our clients can learn client by client by client what is the rest of world asking for, and then have that checklist and let our clients peel us away from kind of that 20 items if your team only wants 10 items or 5 items or 7 now and then later. So I think that inventory of all the different things they could ask for and all the different things we can provide should be provided for TA. A lot of vendors are kind of throwing it to the client and saying, you need to run that bias audit, or I don't think the client should have to, hire the data scientists, hire the engineers, hire the external vendors. We should provide as vendors both the raw ingredients in case that client wants to provide it, as well as the bias audits run by external experts on our systems for that client. And I think that last piece is, we as vendors can have opinions and views, but that external advisor, expertise, consultant, we provide that without cost to our clients so that they can get both, our own opinions, our own audits, but also an external expert in this space to work with them and work with their teams. Their teams might not have had an AI for talent acquisition deployed, nor should they have to know what to ask or know what, the latest court thinking or the latest regulatory thinking is. So I think both that raw data, as well as that advisory and consultancy, and that battery of tests and audits at any point in time. Usually we're asked on a quarterly basis for that, just like you would verify my SOC 2 type 2 compliance or my penetration test. That ethical AI and bias audit should be similarly available at a continued cadence for that client.
Yeah, it's definitely more controversial when you start to think about those bias audits and any just kind of custom analysis. I know when I've asked some vendors, they really start to get uneasy about that, and then just throw out, oh well, that's proprietary, and I really feel like they probably just don't know, and perhaps as a salesperson representing that, and so they don't know. Should we be leery of those if they don't, or are we just maybe not asking the right person with the front end salesperson?
So, I think there's companies that sell to federal government contractors and ones that might be earlier off, right? Maybe they've sold to startups or technology companies,
Sure.
Maybe not yet met that bar or that requirement. Doesn't mean they can't get there. Doesn't mean they might not know what you're looking for, or if this is the first few times that TA department has implemented an AI, you might want them to have a higher level of readiness. I think it also goes, Cathy, to what's the risk of that decision-making engine? Mm-hmm. If they're not already auditing the algorithms for bias, monitoring the input and output, monitoring the machine learning and training and providing that evidence, and let's say they do things just with passive talent community candidates and recruitment marketing tech or ad tech or attraction tech, that might be lower risk versus anyone who touches an internal, an internet applicant rule candidate, or starts to get into that, what we call high risk or what the EU calls high risk, kind of into that spectrum. So I think my short answer to that question would be, it's on every TA leader to say, one, if this is the first time I'm bringing an AI in, I might want for that legal team, for that compliance team to know that I'm picking a vendor that has that higher level of readiness versus our 4th, 5th, 6th, where maybe we can be more experimental or run a pilot or take a bigger risk. I think it also, what type of technology is this? And is that operating in a place where even our humans have very little room for error? So we can kind of triangulate in that same way of just what would the risk of that be?
Yeah, Yeah, that's awesome. I think about it's been a while since I've worked in an OFCCP shop. Are they, just a quick sidebar question, are you seeing more that being part of a contract that really outlines the artificial intelligence compliance piece of that more and more with those federal contracts?
Not a single contract we've signed, maybe 12, 24 months, has not included something about what is our responsibility as a vendor to ensure bias mitigation, bias audits, explainability, transparency, logging, auditing, and provide that continually for the client. So I think that contractual piece is so critical, which I think goes back to when you're working with a vendor that might not have that readiness. That will usually come up either in, we actually say, let's bring that compliance team, let's bring that employment law team in during the sales process, during the evaluation, during the vetting, because we want them to be a stakeholder and a partner. They might even have ideas, which most of our clients have, of if we customize something in some way, or if we produce some audit in some way, then they would be okay with having more automation, or they would be okay with having more technology deployed in that specific place. So I think the earlier we can bring them in, and the clarity that they can give us then helps in that documentation, the legal, the compliance, and the contract be fully aligned and be meeting their expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. Some just quick, I see some quick, chat sessions, and I know that we could really spend a long time, and you and I spent some time talking about this, and I know this is the expert area you're in. I know we'd like to ATAP would like to tee up a full length webinar to really dive into this further. But just in the essence of time, kind of what's the current regulator environment right now? Where are we going to see legislation go in the next year? And really globally for our global partners?
Yeah, so it kind of started in 2016, which most people don't know. They think it's just very recent. As early as 2016, the OFCCP did a call for data science in hiring decisions. We actually submitted at that point in time as kind of, I think, one of the only vendors, or the only vendor, about explainability and the testing abilities of AI for bias, right? And then we've seen just since then a big proliferation. And I think what's unique right now is that it's happening on a city level. So with, for example, New York City Council passing a bias or proposing a bias audit for algorithms in HR. It's kind of like check the box. If you remember how it started with a few cities,
yes,
and then just exploded statewide and then nationally. So I don't know if there's any states left, but it was more gradual. And then you had kind of the rest of, and we're seeing something quite similar, which is state by state legislation regulating the use of artificial intelligence in HR. We are seeing actually hiring be mentioned more and more among high-risk activities. So in the Algorithmic Accountability Act that was proposed, it did not pass in Congress, but it was proposed, and it mentioned specifically hiring alongside credit and housing and AI for court decisions. So especially the EU regulations that determine what is a high-risk AI, that including also hiring, AI for hiring. So I think what we're seeing is an inclusion more and more of technologies, especially AIs involved in the hiring process, be added to this list of high-risk activities and be added to this continually growing slate of how data is used and does the individual know? So touching on privacy and consent, explainability, and documented decision making, so that a person at any point in time could theoretically go in and say, I want to know how the AI decided I was a good fit or was not a good fit, and that needing to be provided to them. Just like in GDPR, you have to provide how you use their data and what data you use of them. So that explainability of decision parameters. And then this last piece is increasingly the demand on the algorithms that are company specific basis, that they show that they do not treat similarly qualified candidates differently, which most TA leaders would say, well, our humans have always had to do that, but we've not seen that demand of algorithms until very recently. And I think that will just pick up and continue.
Sure. I see Jerry Crispin commenting in the chat about how the EA is way ahead of us, and we have to think about that from a U.S. standpoint, that we're behind, and do firms like yours go to legislation first, and try to set the standard before it gets set for us, right? I don't know if that's something that you guys have a philosophy in or believe in. It's a little curveball question for you.
Curveball, of course, coming from Jerry.
Yeah.
So I think, it's not new that the EU has been ahead of us in personal data use, in privacy, and now in autonomous decision making, right? I think what is new is that it's increasingly ahead in auditing and testing requirements to show that you are doing the right thing and the lawful thing and the fair thing. However, if you read kind of through the EEO and OFCCP regs, we would say, well, that's been a standard practice. It's just not been codified in the same way that the EU is more clearly including that into the basket of requirements of AI versus of specific HR policies. So I think it's a sign of the times. I don't think that will decrease. I think that will just increase. And I think that the way that people are treated, the way that decisions are made about people specifically in if they get a job or if they get a promotion or who is offered what at a company, I think will become a larger and larger focus of the regulation body.
Awesome. Well, I know that ATAP would definitely, being still relatively new, would love to get into the advocacy and legislation to help set some of those standards. And I see Jerry, reference that as well, that's an opportunity for us to lead that. So it's awesome, suggestion. We are at time, and we knew this would happen. It's such an interesting topic, and great comments, Denise, and we can really talk about that. We go on for the ethics piece of it and the fairness for an hour alone. So really fascinating, Athena. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And we will definitely be looking to set that new session up, because the conversation, as you said, it's just going to keep changing. And so we need to make sure that we're staying abreast of those situations.
Yeah, and excited to see the standards with groups like ATAP form so that TA leaders really know what are the rules of engagement, what is expected of them, and can follow that without choosing that or an innovation or a transformation agenda. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. All right. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.